Abdulaziz Abdulwaleed Hussein. I work with Connected Development. Good morning, all. My name is Odiba Solomon. I work for Cisco.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Darina Piruku from Arise TV.
Good morning, all. My name is Coach Manassas from Leadership.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Adisa.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Chimezie Dr. from Leadership.
Good morning, all. My name is Ingrid Gucci. I'm a newspaper magazine for Good morning, everyone. My name is Mercy Babakide from News and From.
Good morning, everybody. My name is Abdullah Ismail. I'm Programs Manager of Keep Africa Initiative.
Good morning, everyone. I'm Paul Bakile from the Health Development Service.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Mohammed.
Good morning, everyone. I am Chidime Okoye and I'm from Arise News.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Raki. I work for Oxford.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Vincent Sikisha, report for Quality TV.
Good morning, everybody. My name is Juliana.
Good morning, everybody. I am Princess Avery at the 8 years serving News Africa.
My name is Sarah from this service. Good morning, everyone. I'm Ernest.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Harry Udon, representing STEPS to Sustainable Transformation and Urban Foundation.
My name is Gideon Dixon, and I'm representing Policy Alert.
Morning, everybody. My name is Henry Faro from Body Foundation.
Henry Boucher, representing Oxford Country.
My name is Sisla.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Chidima Onyadiwichi, representing the Bank Directors Association of Nigeria.
Thank you all for that round of introduction. We want to, we're supposed to go straight to the agenda. If you have the agenda with you, we're supposed to receive the presentation from Dr. Auguste. We were trying to see how we can get Constant to read it live.
Will you get to this one? Yeah, okay. Yeah, well. Please grant Augustine access. Listen. Captain Augustine. See there. Okay. Does he have access? How are we showing it on TV? It's connected. Maxwell. Maxwell. Hold on. Yeah, it's connected. That's the code. No, we are on. It's connected.
So, Dr. Augustine, can you confirm if you can hear us? You can hear us, okay. Can you increase? Speak, let's hear you, please. Dr. Augustine, can you speak, let's hear you?
The camera is from
Pardon? I can hear you.
So we are on your session now. So you just introduce yourself and go straight to the presentation of the first ever comprehensive and systemic policy assessment that was conducted on Nigeria for leading banks. So over to you now, sir. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that. I don't know, is my slide off already?
No, we are waiting.
Okay. So good morning, everyone. It's a pleasure to meet everyone. My name is Dr. Augustine Kerry, lead researcher as well as the research officer of connected development. Our work with this policy assessment was with the support of the coalition members for Fair Finance International, was to unpack the policies around the financial institutions in Nigeria, for financial institutions in Nigeria, to look at how that aligns with the global best practices and reporting standards. And like the Fair Finance Coalition is all about, the aim is to create a risk amongst financial institutions in terms of trying to benchmark and compare as fast.
I think your screen is closing. The remote, the cast network.
Dr. Austin, we can see your screen.
Yes, I can hear you.
Yeah, we can see your screen.
Okay, so I can go ahead, right?
Yes.
Okay, let me go ahead. Once again, I was saying that what I intend to do is to speak about the methodology, because to understand methodology that led us to this point whereby we were able to, as a coalition, we're able to get these findings. Because the more we understand it, then we understand where the Fair Finance Nigeria is coming from, as well as Fair Finance International is coming from. So by way of, I know this must have been covered, but let me also speak about it. Fair Finance Nigeria is a coalition of 6 organizations in Nigeria that have been working closely around majority of the issues highlighted, include Budget Foundation, CISLA, Connected Development, Policy Alert, Steps to Sustainable Transformation and Empowerment Foundation, as well as Oxfam Nigeria. Fair Finance Nigeria is also part of the larger Fair Finance International network of over 20 countries across the globe. What this network does is that, particularly in terms of the policy to compare finance and investment policies across financial institutions in relation to ESG standards and sustainability. Another work that Fair Finance International actually does is to examine how financial institutions apply some of these sustainability criteria towards its daily practices. So it should be expected that these practices should not only apply to its internal operation, but also in terms of its value chain and its supply chain and company that it invests into. And that's what we hope to do, or that's what we intended for around this policy assessment that we do today. Now, when we go to the report itself, in terms of the first of this kind in terms of this first policy assessment by the Fair Finance Nigeria. It's targeted mostly to help banks and also regulators and also necessary stakeholders within the financial sector that are mostly in terms of project lending within the financial sector. Not just project lending to those that are providing credit and lines of credit to different stakeholders across different areas. The objective of this, around this policy assessment, is to, what the target is to encourage social corporate responsibility or corporate social responsibility by financial institutions. Encourage it in the sense that it moves beyond the understanding of philanthropic strategic corporate social responsibility. Institutions should understand that they owe it to the societies where they exist in terms of how their responsibilities and the decisions of business decisions that they take also impact the environment. That is, the society
recording in progress.
They already exist on corporate media. They look at issues around what are the expectations of different stakeholders, not only those that have the responsibility. In addition to this, what also it hopes to do is to look at this vis-a-vis how our financial institutions navigating the compliance with international norms and international ethical practices and standards. Because while Nigeria or while most of these financial institutions can exist or banks can exist in their country, they also looking at global markets as a result of globalization. They play at a global stage. So these are international norms that many banks have signed on to, and they also want to look at the compliance around that level. And why is this important to look at? It's because these align clearly with the risk components of the financial institution or banks. Because complying with these standards not only help banks in terms of their internal business operations as well as their subsidiaries, but it also helps them to navigate risks and mitigate against risks within supply chain or companies that they invest in, or even their value and entire business value chain. That's why this is also important too. It helps in terms of navigating risks as this risk continues to increase. And the best way for us to do it is mostly to look at the policies. What are the set standards? What are the set statements that banks or financial institutions have made, and how they have been able to record most of what they intend to do, and in terms of how they make it public and how they share it with necessary stakeholders. Because the more once it is made public, it also affects the specific issues and also different sectors. And that's what we try to do in the entirety of this policy assessment. And I would like to also re-emphasize here that this might be the first policy assessment in Nigeria, but for the Fair Finance International Network, the policy assessment has gone on in some other countries for years, 5 years and more. So it's the first time it's happening in Nigeria, but it's a practice that's happening in other parts of the world, even in countries among coalition members in Africa. I know that we have South Africa, we have Ghana, and some other African countries. So it's an international thing that's done, and this is the first of its kind in Nigeria, and we'd like to see more of this going forward. Now, if we go into the policy assessment itself, particularly in terms of the methodology itself, the conduct of this policy assessment was done under specific criteria and guidelines drawn up by the Fair Finance International as well as Profondo. These are leading organizations that have looked at issues around sustainability, issues around ESG, issues around benchmarking companies' practices with international standards and application. And the application of the Fair Finance methodology is what was used to conduct this policy assessment in Nigeria for the four banks that we evaluated. Now, the methodology is always updated. I think every 2 years is usually updated. So the one that was used for this current policy assessment in Nigeria was just updated in 2025. So it was updated in 2025. We use it also for the first time in 2025 to look at the performance of the four banks that we evaluated. And the four banks we evaluated, as well known, is Access Bank, United Bank of Africa, Standard Chartered, as well as Zenith Bank. The reasons why we selected these banks are mostly based on the share market value of these banks in terms of how they've been performing and their customer base. Mostly known in terms of the banks, in terms of their reach, in terms of their capitalization, as well as in terms of how much customers are using these banks. So we look at these banks as very, very important. Another motivation for looking at these banks was that I think last year, or maybe a year ago, early last year, the Fair Finance Nigeria conducted a case study looking at Nigerian extractive sector, and these banks were also active in Nigeria oil and gas sector, and that's why we also felt we need to look at these banks going forward. In terms of methodology is organized into 19 teams, or what these teams are called sustainability teams. And these 19 teams are categorized into 3 different categories. The first, cross-cutting, the next, sectoral teams, and then the other is operational teams. These 3 categories. What we intend, or what we did with this methodology, what methodology advised us to do, which we did, was look at the content in terms of to what extent are banks, in terms of what extent do the policy meet with the criteria of the Fair Finance International methodology. Again, scope, to what extent, or in terms of how was this policy applied in terms of all relevant types of investments that the banks was making, in terms of the different investment categories that they are making, assets and propriety. I think there are 4 areas of investment categories that we looked at. Last but not least, another thing was to ensure that whatever we assessed was based on banks fully available information. That is, we did not assess any document that was not made public. So it's mostly what banks have already put out in the public that we assessed during this policy assessment. And in the 2025, for this 2025 methodology, coalitions were also the things that we focused on were mostly things that relate to climate change, corruption, gender equality, human rights, labor rights, biodiversity, tax, and transparency and accountability. These were teams that meet the necessary 3 category criteria in terms of cross-cutting, sectoral, and operational teams. Now, while we again look at this, we also need to understand the international benchmark standards that the coalition hoped to evaluate the policies of this bank vis-a-vis. That is, what are those international best practices standards that is expected that companies and financial institutions like banks should and these are some of them, and this resulted this standard that quality assessment. And these include the international financial reporting standard, UN guiding principle of business and human rights, the Equator principles, UN Global Compact, IS standards in terms of labor, and OECD guiding standards for MSMEs, as well as sector-specific standards, because there are areas that different banks provide money to, and there are sector standards in terms of energy and so on. So these are their sector-specific standards. What we did was to look at what banks have disclosed in terms of their public policies And how do these align closely with majority or most of these international benchmark standards? That's what we try to do. Now, for the methodology, remember I said that we looked at the 8 different themes that I mentioned. Each of these themes consisted of a set of assessment questions, that is, questions that speak closely to what were those things talking about. So, if, for example, we're looking at corruption, for instance, there are specific set of questions that the methodology highlights that we need to look at vis-a-vis what banks have disclosed publicly. Now, these thematic questions or these assessment questions do not only focus on the internal operation of banks. So it's not just about disclosing or answering the question in terms of what banks have disclosed internally. It also applies to the external operation as to how our banks apply those international standards or how they're disclosing those international standards also to their business value chain as well as to their supply chain. Shows it. So it's not just on international, on the internal aspect, but also at the external operator. And then we also, we expect to see that banks are making or have this set out and make these statements, and that's how we look at it. It's like I said, it's based on the international standards, but what we also looked at were the principles in terms of making statements or clear statements, clear principles, clear guidelines that banks put in their policies and not necessarily. So focus was most on the principles that was set, formulated as principles, and not necessarily the actions. That's what we looked at. Now, if we go into the scoring of the policy assessment, what we did was to look also at how to score it. And the methodology defines how we are expected to give scoring to banks within the categories or thematic areas that we looked at. So we give a basic score of 1 if this principle is seen clearly in the bank's policy. That is, if the bank makes a statement in terms of a principle, not necessarily action I've that aligns closely with those international benchmark practices, we give the bank a score of 1, a 1 score, right? And that's a basic score. Now, the basic score, I remember this basic score is applied across different themes. Please bear with me if I need to explain all this method because it's very important. Because once we start talking about the findings, it's necessary to understand how we got to this point. And the basic score is then multiplied by the scope score. The scope score is mostly those categories in terms of corporate credit, project finance, proprietary asset, and asset management that the banks are actively engaged in. And the scope score is usually from 50 to 100% within the 4 categories. So if a bank, for instance, is active in project finance, and it has a score of 1 attending to a certain question, it is multiplied by the percentage of its activity in project finance. That's how we get to this scoring level. Then the calculation is, if the basic score is met, and that's the 1, and then we multiply by the scope score, which I've mentioned the different scope category, corporate credits, project finance, proprietary asset, and asset management, and that's how we get a result. The result is usually within the scale of 0 to 1, but it is later put on a larger scale of that, the total overall score of 0 to 10. So for each thematic area or each assessment question, the score is within a 0 to 1. But the accumulation of all those within a sector team or within a sector category is a scale of 0 to 10. And that's how we got to assess the banks. I'll give an example of this is an example of maybe how we also looked at this. So for the bank's policy is sufficient. If it's not sufficient, it receives a basic score of 0. If the scope area, that the scope category of the policy is not relevant, it automatically receives a 50. Because it's already indicated, if it's active there, it gets a 50. But then if the scope basic score is 0, and then the scope score is 50, it gets a 0. But if it's partially sufficient, it gets a scope score, a basic score of 1,
and then if it's not relevant in terms of the scope of the policy, it's not relevant, it still gets its 50. But then if that's multiplied, it gets its 0.5. Where we were hoping to see was that if it's sufficient, that if the bank's policy is sufficiently stated and gets a 1, and then it also applies it in all its categories, the four categories I mentioned, it gets 100, and that's where it gets a final score of 1. So this is like an overview of how these scores were achieved or reached at these different policies. Now let's go into how we eventually conducted the policy assessment for the banks. This exercise had a specific timeline, which was clearly communicated to the financial institutions, the banks that were selected. And it went on from July to November 2025. And the 4 banks were duly informed by sending physical copies of the letter, stipulating the timeline, stipulating the objectives, stipulating the methodology, and how we intend to go ahead with the policy assessment. So all the banks that had their corporate head offices in Lagos. Most of the banks, as we all know, like Zenith Bank, Access Bank, UBA, have their corporate headquarters in Lagos. But Standard Chartered, most of you would know, the head office is not really in Nigeria. But we also sent a letter to the Nigerian head office to inform them about the policy assessment that we intend to go ahead with. The letter also stipulated that the deadline, that the cutoff point for publicly available massive document of published policy was 8th of August 2025. That is, if we get any document, and there was a window period whereby banks could have given us more information to conduct this policy assessment. So if the deadline was 8th of August, any document that was published after 8th of August was not taken into consideration in this assessment. And this was clearly stipulated in the letter that was sent to the financial institutions, the banks. After the assessment was conducted, the result was eventually shared with the 4 financial institutions and for them to comment as well as for further discussion, because the objective of all this is to have further discussions with the banks in terms of engaging them to see how we can maybe work closely in terms of getting more information from them, so that when we are conducting policy assessment in the future, we'll take all these things into cognizance. And this is what we do. Now, for the findings, which is the meat of what we are here for, we found across the different themes that we looked at for all the banks, we found that the overall average of all the themes, that is biodiversity, climate change, corruption, gender equality, human rights, labor rights, tax, and transparency and accountability, the overall average was 1.7 over 10. That is, out of 10, they scored 1.7. And this clearly shows, in terms of the graph I'm showing here, how individually banks perform in different areas. For example, Access Bank, in terms of biodiversity, had a 2.7. Standard Chartered had a 3.5, while UBA had a 1.3. Zenith Bank had 0.0. And then the overall average of biodiversity was 1.7. So this, and I'll advise everyone, or I encourage everyone to get the report, read through the report, and then you see how we unpack most of these themes and the specific themes around how they achieve these scores. And the numbers, maybe the numbers will not tell the true story. So that's why I decided to also pick specific examples. For maybe what I speak about is now those specific examples. Now we find out that most of the banks, in terms of their highest performing teams, were in the area of labor rights, whereby Access Bank scored a 3.3, Standard Chartered Bank scored a 4.3, UBA scored a 2.1, and then Zenith Bank scored a 3.2, particularly in corruption team. These were the area that the banks performed so much. They also had relatively high performance in areas of gender equality, human rights, and with an average thematic score of 2.0, at least across board. But if we start looking at the areas that banks did not perform so well, where they perform a little bit poorly, and it is mostly the transparency, accountability, taxes, and also parts of climate change across most of the banks. Notably, across the teams, the score was below 5.0. That's across these teams I've mentioned. The score was below 5.0. Many banks were scoring between 0 or 2 out of 10. So the average score for these teams was between 0.0 and 1.3, especially for tax and transparency, respectively. Now, this doesn't paint the true picture, and that's why I need to go to these examples. We also understand what we are assessing in each of these banks' policies. And I also want to mention part of what we looked at in terms of the policy that we looked at for these banks were policy documents that they had on their website or what they had clearly circulated in the public in terms of their annual report, in terms of their sustainability report, in terms of ESRM standards, their environmental risk management policy, gender policy, every policy that was available. In fact, the scoring sheet had a list of all the documents that we assessed for every bank. So every bank can go and see the documents that we use to assess most of these statements. Now, in area where most of banks perform well, we picked labor particularly in terms of where we found that they perform well. I would like to show examples of what made them to perform well in those areas. So part of the labor element was that companies are expected to uphold freedom of association and effective recognition of the right to collective bargaining. Now, this is an example of a labor element in the labor theme that we evaluated. An example we see in Access Bank's policy, in Access Bank ESRM policy, particularly in Appendix 2, it states clearly that Access Bank shall not finance prospective or any act involving production or active or forced child labor. So, in what I'm trying to say here is that when we look at this element, we think statement that policy that think clearly that they would not finance anything that has to do with forced child labor, and that gives them a score, which is that issue around freedom of association as well as in terms of collective bargaining, also in terms of child labor being unacceptable. Another example is in terms of Standard Charter. Standard Charter's modern slavery statement in page 8 categorically stated that the bank shall not condone it does not condone child labor. At the same time, it also applies the IFC performance standard in terms of labor rights. So that's why if Access Bank or Standard Charter scored so well in labor element, is because of some of these specific statements that they make in their policy, which are benchmarked to international best practices. Another example of which I'd like to show is areas that they didn't do so well, like banks did not do so well. In terms of tax schemes or in terms of climate elements that we assess, this is an example whereby for each country in which a financial institution operates, it produces a report, a country by country report in terms of revenues, in terms of profit, in terms of FSTs, FTS, in terms of salaries that is received from government and tax payments to government in a way that matches its consolidated account. We looked at consolidated accounts of most of the banks that were evaluated, and we did not see most of these stage. Again, excuse me. Again, we also looked at if a financial institution does not provide financial services to companies in tax haven unless the company has a substantive or it is profit generated from a local economic activity. We looked at the policies of these banks and we did not see any clear indication around this area. In terms of the climate areas, climate elements, the elements indicate, or one of the elements indicated, if financial institutions exclude financing and investments in companies that are active in oil and gas extractive for more than 30% of its revenue. We looked again in the policy of financial institutions, and we don't find any statement to that regard. Also, in terms of its internal operation, if financial institution establish a sector-specific reduction target for its finance emission that aligns with a limit, with limiting the maximum global temperature increase of 1.5 degrees Celsius. We looked again in financial policy documents and we did not find any indication that they had a sector-specific reduction target. And this is why banks that we evaluated did not score high in some of these elements. Now, what does this mean in terms of from what we found? And I also encourage everyone to get the report, read the report, and see how probably most of these elements. What this means, or what we deduce from this, the coalition feels strongly that it is a case of partial disclosure, and this was mostly consistent, whereby most of the financial institutions were prioritizing sustainability teams that are mandated by the CBN. So it's more like for their internal policy, and this was also another area, they were mostly prioritizing those statements or those areas that the Central Bank of Nigeria would look clearly or closely at, or other regulatory bodies within Nigeria. Those are the areas that they were looking closely at and disclosing actively in. In terms of anti-corruption, for example, most of the banks that we evaluated had a clear anti-corruption policy or whistleblower policy. They said a lot of statements around that because the Central Bank is looking around the area. They talked about customer protection or consumer protection. They also talked about internal risk management. Many of the banks had an internal risk standard, internal risk statement that aligns with what the CBN expects. But if we benchmark that on international best practices, that is beyond what CBN looks at, we found that it mostly was a partial disclosure in those areas. Again, disclosures that we found for most of the banks were generic, and they were primarily focused on internal operations. For example, a bank will say, okay, we would limit our emissions to this number. But it does not say how to apply that standard or those standards, which are international benchmark standards, to how it's financing companies or how it's providing finances to companies that are doing activities that increases temperature. So that's an area that we found that is also lacking in most of the bank's financial policies. Again, in contrast, teams that require voluntary leadership in terms of climate change, human rights, labor rights, biodiversity, gender, tax, receive limited attention. That is, banks usually had a kind of generic way of stating most of those areas of climate, human rights, labor rights. It had a generic, like a template kind of way that it would repeatedly state these things year in, year out. And another area was that what we also saw for some financial institutions is that they started joining their sustainability reports with their annual reports. And international best practices expect that banks should actually separate these two documents and also have other documents in between that state these things. Now, most of these that we identified here goes against strategic CSR principles, as well as the international best practices and standards, that whereby financial institutions are closely related to society, understanding stakeholders, and responding to international standards. We found out that these are some gaps that exist there. In terms of what is needed, from all what I've said now, we in the Finance Nigeria strongly believe that banks need to develop standalone sustainability report. I've mentioned that earlier, whereby that is consistent with international best practice. Again, banks also need to publish these things annually, because most of the times, or when we checked most of the documents that we assessed, some banks had, as far as their sustainability report, as a standalone document, the earliest version or the latest version was in 2023, some in 2024. Meanwhile, we are looking at this in 2025. So these were some areas that we felt banks could do clearly or do better. Again, in terms of clearer disclosures, we felt that most of the disclosures that were using generic statements did not necessarily use the necessary GRI standard, Global Reporting Initiative standard, and also financial sector standard. It's more like it was generic and not speaking to specific needs or specific international best practices that clearly stated. Another area was that, or what we feel also, that banks need to endeavor to extend sustainability ethical reporting beyond their internal operation. And I've alluded to this earlier. it's not just about how banks are looking at their internal operation in terms of how they are limiting maybe emissions, or how they are looking at how they are operating in terms of how they are maybe recruiting more women in senior top management positions in terms of the gender areas. But they also need to look at how they are applying these standards to their entire business value chain, as well as their supply chain. Companies that they are investing in, companies that they are giving loans to, companies that they are actively investing in. They need to also look at how are these companies that they are investing in applying these international standards, because it doesn't only allude to the financial institution or the banks themselves, but it also helps in terms of the also align the 2012 Nigerian Sustainability Banking Principle. There's need to align it more closely to international standards. Adjusting it, because this is what this standard, this Nigerian Sustainability Banking Principle, is what majority of banks kind of align with in terms of how they report or how they speak some of these issues. But we feel that there is need to look at how this international standard, how the Nigerian Sustainability Banking Principle standard aligns closely with international best practices, particularly in terms of these areas. That look at standard, global standards for reporting, and also in terms of applying for their international practices as well as their operational practices in terms of where banks are actively engaged. Last but not least, and we feel also strongly around it, is that there is need to encourage more engagement, stakeholder engagement, because financial institutions or banks in Nigeria, we have found, and I know that this will come up in other conversations that we have, whereby the coalition, and not just the coalition, other stakeholders try to engage financial institutions, and they feel that because their primary business, and maybe I'm alleging here, their primary business is mostly in monies, they feel that engaging with NGO, non-governmental organizations around these issues might not be something that is top on their priority. And we advise that these are issues that they need to engage more with non-governmental organizations and also different stakeholders, because these issues are not just issues that affect only the banks, but also companies that they invest in, as well as the society where they exist. So there is need for more engagement around strengthening their ESG engagement, ethical compliance, and also in terms of their sustainability teams. There is need for further engagement around these areas. And we believe that the more we have such engagement, it can help to improve on how we look at their policy, or how banks in Nigeria disclose their performance in these different areas. Thank you very much.
Please a round of applause for Dr. Augustine. Thank you so much, Doc, for that elaborate presentation. We saw the multiple engagement in the room with note taking and all of that. And again, we understand that we possibly have questions, but we strongly recommend that we write them down and we'll get back to them in the plenary section, please. So, without any further ado, again, during the presentation.
Sorry, I can't hear you. Maxwell, I can't hear you.
Oh, yeah. Sorry, yeah, you were still on mute. We were on mute rather. So, all right, yes. Okay, so again, thank you so much, Dr. Augustine, for that very detailed presentation around the methodology notes, how we got the findings, and the reasons behind why the information speaks to 4 banks, and again, the call to action on convening a roundtable discussion around the NSBP of the 2012, so we can have it modernized. Thank you so much. And for questions, including those online, our global team are also online. And please, thank you so much. We see you. Please, if you have questions, please write them down, and we'll get back to them immediately after the press release. And it will be my singular honor to introduce those on the panel section. And
Yeah, Dr. Augustine, please be on standby. Please be on standby. Great, thank you. And on my left, my far right, I beg your pardon, we have Chidima Ayanlewechi, Research and Development Analyst, Bank Directors Association of Nigeria. Thank you so much, Chidima. And on my far left, we have the Executive Director of Ziba Community Initiative in the person of Emily Ofodili. Thank you so much, Madam. And representing Oxfam Country Director, seated at the table, is Henry Richer, who is our Program Manager, Accountable Governance. Thank you so much, Henry. And lastly, we have Mr. Awa Ibrahim Musa Rasfajani, the Executive Director, CISLAC. Thank you so much, sir. And now I'll be passing the microphone over to them and the press session will begin. So please, pressmen, please set up your equipment.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen of the press. Representative of the banking industry, civil society, relevant government agencies. Ladies and gentlemen, it is our honor to once again welcome you to the launch of the Nigerian First Comprehensive Policy Assessment Report on Sustainability and responsible finance in our banking sector. Today marks a significant milestone for the civil society organizations that have worked on this. Civil Society Legislative Advocacy Center, which is the Secretariat of Finance, Code, SAFE, and Oxfam. We would like to once again welcome you to this report presentation. This is a very important step towards strengthening transparency and accountability in the Nigerian finance system. Therefore, after you had the methodology on conducting this report, this assessment, we then decided to say, look, there's a need for both the government, the finance institutions to take drastic measures to address the lapses established in this report. So our statement reads, Nigerian banks score 1.7 out of 10 in global ESG stress tests. And this is coming from this coalition that I mentioned. Finance is not neutral. Every loan and every investment shapes lives, communities, and ecosystems. Yet a groundbreaking new assessment by the Fair Finance Nigeria Coalition revealed that leading commercial banks are failing drastically short of global environmental, social, and governance standards, averaging a dismal 1.7 out of 10 as they act to hide behind outdated regulatory minimum standards. The nation's first ever comprehensive policy assessment evaluated Access Bank, Standard Chartered Bank, United Bank of Africa, and Zenith Bank across more than 400 international sustainability criteria. The results show a banking sector deeply exposed to higher impact risks, yet alarming opaque in its practices. The overall average performance across the assessed banks sits at critically low 1.7, as we had mentioned, out of 10. While the assessment notes relatively better performance in internal operation policies, particularly concerning labor rights, gender equality, and anti-corruption. Their external financing commitment to protect host communities, climate, and national revenue remains virtually non-existent. I'm sure you are aware about the Gamma report that also said that our financial institutions are also being used to finance terrorism. This is a very worrisome and alarming thing. And of course, you know, all the money laundering that is going on in Nigeria is also going through our financial institutions. So therefore, it is necessary that the authority wake up to do the needful. Nigeria is losing a lot of money as a result of illicit financial flow. We are not able to finance development because of the corruption that is going on in our country. Key areas highlighted in this report. This includes a zero on tax transparency. All our banks score an average of 0.0 in tax assessment by refusing to publicly provide country-by-country reporting of revenues and failing to disclose if they finance companies operating in tax havens or zero corporate tax areas. These institutions operate in the shadow. This severe level of opacity undermines the core principle of anti-money laundering frameworks and financial action task force guidelines, ignoring global standards designed to prevent siphoning of vital public resources from developing nations, including Nigeria. On the climate gaps, despite Nigeria's extreme vulnerability to climate change, the banks averaged a shocking 0.9 out of 10% on climate action. The report reveals that banks continue to heavily finance high emission sectors like oil and gas without publishing credible portfolio level transition. As we all know, climate change is a major area for both the government and the private sector to take drastic action to deal with the issue. The third concern that we have, assessment shows that these banks provide zero or weak commitments to safeguarding human rights and biodiversity with their wider investment portfolio and corporate supply chains. The IMF World Bank just concluded its annual meeting in Washington, D.C., and globally banks are committed to standard operation, but our banks are yet to comply with all the best practices. I want to emphasize that this report is not an attack to any bank. It is just an attempt to draw their attention to the best practice. And it is also in line with our financial regulation in this country. And that is why NFIU, EFCC, and other financial institutions, including Central Bank of Nigeria, they are all invited, and we will share this report with them so that they can also take the necessary action. Ladies and gentlemen, as we can see, Nigerian banks have massive influence. Their choices can either accelerate inequality and environmental harms or drive a just and sustainable future. right now, they seem to be failing that test. And this is according to the country director of Oxfam, Tijani Hamza. Scoring 0.0 on a tax transparency and 0.9 on climate change is absolutely unacceptable. These institutions are actually making massive profit from the high impact sector while refusing to be held accountable for social and environmental footprints of their decision. This is not just a disclosure gap, it is a failure of leadership in the financial sector that we just have to advocate that and bridge that gap. We cannot continue in this way. Nigeria is a huge country, it's a big country, and the banking sector in Nigeria are making huge amounts of profit. And therefore, it is only proper for them to comply with the best global best standards and practices. Well, the Standard Chartered Bank achieved the highest average score of 2.7. We note that this is largely due to its global headquarters commitment. It remains unclear if or how these standards are applied to protect communities and ecosystems in Nigeria. So, as a global bank, they try to comply with that, but when it comes to Nigeria, there are still certain gaps that we would like the Standard Chartered Bank to also comply with, so that they can actually close those gaps and also serve as an example or an exemplary bank to other indigenous banks that we have. In fact, as a matter of fact, these banks, they are no longer local. Zenith Bank is operating, in many places, in Africa, and Access Bank is the same. So UBA, if you go to other countries in Africa, you find them. So they are no longer local, and therefore it is only proper that they actually adopt a global best practice, even if not for the sake of only Nigeria, but for the sake of the fact that they need to maintain their reputation, and they need to make sure that the whole world see them as a bank that is not aiding wrongdoing. The current 2022 Nigerian Sustainability Banking Principles are simply outdated, creating gaps that allows banks to avoid genuine sustainable operation. We are happy that the Central Bank of Nigeria is here, and therefore, we believe that they will do everything possible to ensure that these sustainability principles are updated. We cannot be operating in 2026 and then you have something for 2012. I think whoever will do exam for you will tell you. So therefore, it is a call on our government to also do the needful so that they can actually set a good standard for our financial institutions in Nigeria. So fair finance coalition, which I mentioned comprising budget, policy alert, CISLAC, code, state, and Oxfam, is urgently calling on the Central Banks of Nigeria, Chartered Institute of Bankers of Nigeria, the Banks Director Association of Nigeria, whom we are privileged to have here with us. We are all asking them, including the National Assembly, relevant committees on banking sector and bank executive, to convene a multi-stakeholders roundtable to modernize the sector's ESG frameworks to align with the global standards and demand that banks immediately move beyond tick box compliance to genuine corporate finance accountability, because this is what is lacking, and we are hoping that the relevant government institutions and the relevant non-state actors working on financial institutions, they will all come together to look at this. Why we are actually emphasizing on this is because of the importance of the financial sector in Nigeria. If you see any trial going on, largely 90% it is about money. And that money is very, very key and important. And if our institutions are not healthy, our financial institutions are not healthy, then you will be hearing many times people will go to court, it will be taken to court, for wrongdoing or for siphoning or stealing or conniving or for all sorts of things. I think it is important that government help to sanitize our financial institutions, to make it healthy, to make it even attractive for international investors. Look, if the international investors, they find out our financial sector is sick, is not healthy for operation, they may not also invest their resources. So I think it is important that we take this as very serious matter. Ladies and gentlemen, the coalition is being also a major partner of Oxfam Nigeria, and therefore it's my privilege to ask the Oxfam country representative to also highlight, and shed more light on these findings that we have gotten. I want to call on Mr. Henry to take on. Thank you.
Please put your hands together, Mr. Thank you very much. Like Ralph has mentioned, it's quite difficult to speak when Ralph has finished speaking because I think he's made all of the valid points already. But just to re-emphasize that the Fair Finance Coalition is supported by CEDA and the global team, with Oxfam in Nigeria spearheading here in Nigeria, and also ensuring, working closely with CISLAC and the secretariats to ensure that some of these issues around our financial space is actually put right. One of the major objectives really is, like Ralph has mentioned, not to victimize any bank, but to look at some of the operations of banks in a way that, because of the strategic, importance of bank within the financial sector, in terms of how they are able to invest, in a sustainable manner, in terms of how they also operationalize, their interventions in a very sustainable manner, such that it attracts investment, and even those who also engage with the banks also, their own rights also are respected in that sense. If you listen to the presentation earlier, there was a number of global frameworks that we spotlighted in order to enable us come up with this assessment, one of its kind in Nigeria. And if banks are able to follow through, with all of this framework, this global framework, in coalition with some of the ones in our own policies internally in Nigeria, we are able to have a much stronger, reliable financial sector in Nigeria, which will also attract the kind of investment that we are seeking for. Otherwise, we keep having a very porous financial sector that will not give us the kind of investment that we want. One of it is the United Nations Guiding Principles on Human Rights and Business, which Nigeria is a signatory to, and so that principle, enables banks and financial institutions and companies generally in Nigeria who do business and make profit to respect human rights in their value chain, and not just respecting the rights of their own staff, but also respecting the rights of the customers that they deal with every single day. And so we also want to look at, within this intervention, how are banks treating their customers in their daily operations. Do you go to the ATM and you stand under the sun, for instance? I'll give you a practical example. Do you go to the ATM and stand under the sun to access your own funds? Do you go to the bank and then you are not attended to even properly? Even within the banking system, the staff in the bank, are they adequately remunerated? Or do we depend? In the past, we used to know that banks only employ national diplomas, for obvious reasons, because a national diploma person will come in and do the job of a HND, of a higher national diploma. So how do you ensure that people that are employed in the banks are adequately remunerated, they are qualified persons, and there are people who also have, the public perception that people should have about them, see that they serve the public. That's all the nitty-gritty that we want to look at. Just yesterday, some of the institutions that were supposed to be here, some of them called and said they do not want to be in the room because they will have to fly down. So they don't want to incur carbon footprints. And so sometimes but it's laughable, right? But on the other hand, to what extent have they been, keeping to their carbon footprint or observing their carbon footprint over time? When you fly aircraft, you have carbon footprint, right? When you use your vehicle, you contribute also, right? So to what extent are we sustainably not incurring carbon footprints? And so this meeting was supposed to, put those things in the spotlight and ensure that even we as Oxfam, we have a carbon footprint sheet that allows us to calculate the number of times we put on our generator in the office, the number of times the amount of diesel we burn, and to what extent our staff also, being on the road and driving their cars and contributing to carbon. So how will banks also put in place these kinds of nitty-gritty mechanisms to ensure that we drop our carbon footprint, sustainably invest in it, and ensure that we have that environment that ecosystem that is friendly, and that also preserve the kind of ecosystem that we want to see. But just to also mention, right, that on the tax bits, there are 8 elements that have been assessed here. On the tax bits, all of the banks scored 0. 0.0 over 10. All of the banks, subjecting it to our national laws and policy, subjecting it to all of those international global tax principles in terms of whether they publish their own country report or their own their own bank report on tax, whether they are transparent in their tax processes, whether they enable tax evasion or capital flight. All of these banks, subjecting the available information they have in public space to all of these criteria, they scored 0. So what that means is that invariably is that you can deduce from there that these banks is either they are aiding capital flights, they are aiding tax evasion, they are aiding illicit financial flows, and all of those misbehavior that put our country at a very abysmal position. So what do we do with our financial system to ensure that they begin to correct this anomaly? When you go to the banks, you see those flags that says this bank is what do you say? Compliant to Anti-Money Laundering Act. Yeah. But to what extent do they put those in practice? When we subjected that act, pari passu with the reports from these banks, they scored 0. They scored 0. So we are calling on the banks, right, to go pick this report up. We've sent it to them anyway, and they had a privilege to also respond. We are calling on them to read this report, benchmark it with those principles we have, benchmark it with our local principles, policies, and laws, and see how they score by themselves. Sometimes it's good to also score yourself, and then also compare with what other person score you and see how you're doing. So let them also score themselves and then get back to us, and we can see how to proceed with this. But just to say thank you very much for listening and for attending this meeting. And we will also like for us to open the floor to some of our delegates in the room. I see some regulators are also in the room. Perhaps they have 1 or 2 things to say concerning the findings of the report. Thank you very much.
Please a round of applause. To stay in the conversation on this plenary, remember we said if you have questions, you can pen them down or then again, because this is going to be very, very, very conversational. Let's use that term. So please, I'll be handing the mic over to Edijon. He's a program officer at Policy Alert, one of the partners in the coalition. So Eddie, over to you.
All right, thank you, Maxwell. Thank you, Mr. Rafsanjani, Henry, and Austin, for what we've gotten so far. That appears to be a very deep dive. Understandably, what you've heard would naturally elicit reactions in terms of questions, contribution, and even the need for clarification of key aspects of the report. On tax transparency, as Henry just said, the bank scored 0. Climate change, considering our vulnerability to the energy transition, and specific questions around how exposed their portfolios are to the extractive sector. All of those we could not get definite scores from the bank, and those are really concerning areas. So this is the time for questions. We're actually opening up the floor, both for those online and those in this meeting room. Questions? Okay. Okay, so I think we'll be able to take this in threes. Is that another microphone? Yes. Okay, so let's start with that. Kindly your name and your question. Let's be brief as possible to make use of
Thank you very much. I'm really glad to be in this room this morning. My name is Puato Dioko, and I'm coming from the National Human Rights Commission. I'm glad this is happening now, although it's under the auspices of ESG. But I don't know how many of you know that Nigeria has a policy on the BHR under the United Nations Guidelines, which of course every member country is expected to comply by having their own national action plan on business and human rights, and to ensure that businesses comply. And I remember before before even the adoption of this document, we had trained regulators that we felt had remedial capacity to ensure monitoring and compliance on this policy. CBN was one of those regulators. We had them, we had NCC, to regulate the communication sector, we had the extractive sector, and we actually trained them to measure their their mandates and see how they have the ability to comply with it and make businesses accountable. And I'm glad that somehow CBN started something, because the commission had received a request from one of those bureau de change somewhere in Zamfara, asking us to draft a human rights compliance assessment for them. That was the criteria that CBN had given them before they can actually be registered, and we were glad that happened. But I don't know if they had cascaded that to other commercial banks and some other sectors. So I wanted to find out how is it that in the course of doing this, you didn't make reference to the local policy that we have already on ground to also see how they've been able to comply. I know there were elements of it in there, but I think they said charity begins at home, and we should have least started from the National Action Plan on Business and Human Rights that Nigeria has adopted. We're already on the mid-cycle now this year, and it's supposed to be expiring in 2028. Thank you very much.
All right. Okay, let's take the second one. Okay, let's take someone online. Benga Adeleke, let's have you. You can unmute.
I just did. Good afternoon, everyone. I hope everyone can hear me.
Yes, please go ahead.
Okay, so I just want to start by appreciating the convener of this program and everyone that have taken out time to attend. This is a very, very important event to us as a country, and we've actually noted all the context around what was discussed. I work for Access Bank, and I like to also note that we received the report in question. This report has received the highest level of visibility in the bank that I work for. We have reviewed it. We are communicating with the stakeholders, the people that did the review. So I'll just quickly go straight to the points that I wanted to raise. So I've noted some of the points that we have here. We are also double clicking even further to take the conversation to a higher level, especially with the stakeholders. So quickly jumping around what we have here, I've noted what was mentioned around biodiversity context, the tax-related discovery that was mentioned, and so on and so forth. So I think a few things just need to be tinkered a little bit, especially around the methodology that was used to arrive at what was at the reports. So today so very quickly jump straight to the biodiversity discovery or the revelation that we have here. When I speak to the methodology around here, so maybe all the banks engaged or some of the banks engaged, but I can speak specifically for Access Bank. I noted something from what was presented by Dr. Okere, that some banks mentioned that they use IFC performance standard. Now, IFC performance standard 6 is the fact that maybe they did not mention it explicitly, and that's why I'm speaking to the methodology. Performance standard 6 is a global best practice requirement, and there is also a relationship with Nigerian Sustainable Banking Principle. That's because the Nigerian Sustainable Banking Principle, released by Central Bank of Nigeria, referenced IFC performance standard. So for performance, so a bank may not mention explicitly biodiversity. By inference, but it's already talking about biodiversity, but we're not saying the word biodiversity. Maybe further engagement with the stakeholders whose banks were used to do the assessment would have done some form of clarification around that. Now, talking about tax issues, use of shell, opaque companies, tax haven, and so on and so forth. I want to, because where this report may go to, it may be speaking to the conscience of Nigeria as a whole. The banks that we're talking about here, maybe they are in terms of financial institutions, commercial bank, they are representing Nigeria in one way or the other. And we have regulators that are reviewing and checking, and banks, of course, the financial report is revealed, the tax component is revealed, there will be notes to the published finance report, but details around tax haven, opaque.
So,
that while you have your sometimes most banks will have their abridged version of their sustainability report in their consolidated financial or annual report. They need to have the full detailed one. The abridged version obviously would cover some aspects of it, but then the link would be having a full report, sustainability report covering other issues or explaining more of the nitty-gritties around some of those issues indicated in the earlier abridged versions. The issue also we've seen in this, during this, conducting this exercise, is not even the aspect about, maybe in terms of dividing it, it's mostly the aspect of frequency. Many banks do not, in terms of maintain that frequency in terms of publishing their, for example, sustainability report. But that doesn't also stop the existence of some other policy. I know Access Bank, for instance, has some important policy that it looks and links closely to its operations. It's very, very important. And that's where we also want to hinge on. And that will lead me to the next point Mr. Baker also raised, with regards to collaboration and information. While we conducted this activity, there is also the need, or there was the need for us to have more engagement. And the opportunity to engage with banks was not there. In terms of, we tried to reach out as much as possible, but many of the banks either did not respond or even responded at the time when we had moved to the next aspect of the research. But we see very well that having forum like this provides an opportunity for more consultation. Because like I said, these disclosures might be a little bit light, but if we had further engagement with financial institutions, banks, it could have provided us with more nudging or more indication as to where we could find those information. Just as the point you made with regards to taxation, in terms of how these things were reported. And I'm trying to discuss most of the points you already raised. Yes, these standards that we talked about in terms of methodology for taxation, even we also about biodiversity disclosure, the expectations, the methodology expects that certain statements or certain phrasing of principle should be in this policy. And it's something that it should be repeated year in, year out, year in, year out. And I'll give a clear example. For the fact that some financial institutions publish their annual reports constantly and reporting to most of these principles, they are listed in the Equator Principles. They are listed as signatories of the Equator Principles, of which many banks are. But some banks will be listed on partially on the Equator Principle, and if they don't do it constantly, they are delisted. So the more we have such engagement in terms of moving or advocating for banks to have most of these statements clearly stipulated out, even just as Mr. Henry has said, just making a statement saying that, oh, we do not engage in this, we do engage in this, we finance this, we do not finance with this. It helps to solve most of these issues, not just for us as non-governmental organizations engaging with banks, but also for other general public. It also helps in risk, it also helps in risk mitigation. And also I'd like to add one more question or respond to one more question in regards to the issue of the issue on human rights and the local content of compliance with standard. The methodology set out for the fair finance methodology and the standards that we use, although I made a presentation covering some of the standards, it's in terms of human rights, there are key standards that we also benchmark with. And these standards are standards that international or local human rights principles are built on. Among such is the United Nations Declaration on Indigenous Peoples' Rights, the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, also in terms of the Trana Declaration. These are all principles that most of the national human rights are also built on, and these are embedded in this methodology. So we might have not taken, or the methodology does not take fully cognizance of all the specific local context. Remember I said, the methodology applies to a lot of countries in the world. So what we also use to benchmark in terms of human rights are global declaration and global standards for human rights. Thank you.
All right, thank you. So we'll talk to the EFCC for remarks.
Thank you very much for this privilege and opportunity. I actually would say that I commend the industry that has been put into this assessment report. I may not be able to say so much because I've not had the opportunity of seeing the report itself to have digested it and to make appropriate and definite comments. But from what I heard, or from the little I heard in the room, I want to say that the initiative is quite commendable. I mean, it's the first of its kind. And I know that subsequently there will be better presentations of assessment. My concern, just like Austin has already tried to explain, was whether primary data was sourced or was access to primary data in having this report. Primary data understands is very key when you're trying to develop an assessment of a particular issue. Though he has explained that it wasn't possible for them to get this primary data. But I think it's still very questionable that we are on the assessment relied only on secondary data from the website. Because even the banks themselves can falsify information on their website. So I'm suggesting that in future assessments like this, there should be a strategy to see how information put on the website could also be verified from other sources. reports like this are very important. You know, they could serve both purposes, either to disrupt the system or even fail to achieve the purpose of which it made. I want to say categorically that from what I've heard so far, the issues raised in the report are of substantial interest to the EFCC, and I'm sure that by the time we look at that report, we'll be able to address certain issues, or probably pick out issues that we will work with. I see the report much more like an intelligence report that assists us also to do our work, because in a way we have certain responsibilities.
Thank you. So we'll still come back to plenary to address questions, but we'd like to be the report launch itself at this time, and we want our media partners to be integral to that. So, so that you don't lose your thoughts, you can write down your questions, and we'll return to, we'll still plenary possibly after that. So I'll yield to. So, Precious will coordinate the launch of the report and the footage session following that.
Okay, thank you everyone. We're about to begin the unveiling of the reports. Give me an S. Give me an G. I also like to call the partners to come forward. Representative of Code, STEP, Policy Alerts.
We have restriction for me. Oh, okay. Okay, public institution now.
So before the closing remarks, we can take two more questions. Are there still questions? Any question we didn't attend to? Okay, no question.
Hello.
Sorry, let's take this.
Okay, hold on. Just before your question, please. The report is available online, likewise the press statement. So if you log on to nigeria.oxfam.org and latest for publications, you will see the first ever report on EFD compliance for banks in Nigeria. So that is the report. It's available online for download and quick assessment. So please, Eddie, over to you.
Okay.
We all know that running the banks, doing the business.
Hello, can we have your attention, please?
know that running on grants and doing the business are quite two different things. So I don't know if, and we're saying that on the report advising the bank not to finance oil production activities or cut it down. I don't know if they had thought about how the bank will survive doing such, because that's business. Then you're also asking them to check who they give loan to. So to what extent they know the plan, maybe solid, and what rights do they have over other organizations?
So the question is, Mr. Henry, and so he's asking if we are raising concern around the bank's portfolio to extractive activities as it relates to biodiversity and climate change. Are we mindful of what that does to the revenue to the bank? Are we not undermining? Would the bank not be undermining themselves if they stick to the principle that we have? So I'd like you to respond to that.
So I know on biodiversity and climate change. So the report is clear on that. And the point is that, right, as much as...
Sorry, one house please.
Hello. Yes. So as much as we are hard on the banks to be compliant along those things, we are also in a way also easy on them, because the country itself, in terms of transition minerals and all of that, is also still not as compliant in its own operations and policies. For instance, the what do you call it? The gas transition. Yes. Like Nigeria having gas, saying gas is its own energy transition mineral. So that alone is a contradiction on its own, because gas is fossil, right? But again, given our condition, our economic condition and our status as a resource-rich country, we can't just transition overnight. It has to be gradual. But what I say to the banks is that under biodiversity, ensure that the ecosystem is friendly, because it's good for business. Yeah, there are organizations who will not invest in Nigeria if your financial system is not doing well in that respect. So that's the point we are making along that line. You want to? Okay, please.
In 1 minute, the country has any priorities what we call mitigation reduction guidelines. People operating in that sector are already mandated to begin to put in place plans to reduce emissions across all their operations. What we are saying banks should do is that start demanding these plans and standards from the companies you finance. That is to align with the country's goals. I said the time for it, yes.
Let me start the closing remark and hand over to my colleague, Sujani. Just to say thank you on behalf of Oxfam and the country director, Mr. Sujani Hamzat, who is not here, to thank colleagues and stakeholders for obliging us your time today and for all the comments you have made. We are taking back some of these comments as part of the validation for this report. Like we mentioned, we're going to go further with the report. The next step for us will be to also compartmentalize this report, to break it down into targeting each of the banks directly. So you have 4 different products coming out targeting each of the banks. What we'll also try to do, I'll discuss with my colleagues to see how we can also localize it, given our local laws, like you mentioned, our local laws, as also the international laws as well. That could be another product that we will be having. And then we're also planning to have like a stakeholder convening where the National Assembly will be here and other relevant regulatory agencies to see what we can get out of it, ensuring that we begin to review relevant policies and frameworks that will help banks to sit up. So with that, I want to say thank you so much for coming, and then I will hand over finally to my colleague.
Thank you very much, Marie. So on behalf of the network, we'd like to thank you once again for your active participation. There are a lot that can be done with this report, definitely we will carry further advocacy. We will engage in dialogue. We will engage in every advocacy that will make sure that we have the reforms in our financial system in the country, because we need to have a healthy financial institution that respects both local and international law, and that people will feel comfortable to relate with, and that will not be used for money laundering and illicit act flow, because that has negative implication for our development quest. We are not able to finance development because of corruption, and corruption is also being supported in many ways. If financial institutions are used to support budgets that are meant to provide water, to provide road, to provide healthcare, provide education, then definitely it's a serious concern. So we will also be engaging with the banks, because we are not antagonistic to the banks. What we want, we just want to assist them that will work in the country respectively with observance of international and national laws that we have in our country. Once again, thank you very much for all our our partners that have been here. Thank you for your participation and your attention, and we are going to carry the next step and definitely reach out to you so that we can continue to work together as a civil society. Thank you very much.